Hey everybody, welcome back to Daniel's Side of the Story, where I just go through that week's chapter of the story and I share a little bit of my thoughts and what I got out of the reading. So this week we're on chapter 6 and we're talking about Israel as they're wandering through the wilderness. As I was reading through this chapter, I was reminded of just a little bit more of who God is. I'd say that's probably the biggest thing that I got out of this reading, because despite everything that happens, there are so many different opportunities that I have to be able to understand who God is when I read through chapter 6 in the wilderness. We can see that God, He demonstrates that He is a provider for His people. They don't need to they don't have a need to worry about what they're going to eat, what they're going to drink. They're provided with manna and quail to sustain them. Of course, we can see that Israel is grumbling and complaining, asking, "We want meat. This manna, which is what we need, isn't good enough anymore. Now we want this," which I think has some personal application. The more you get, it's not always going to satisfy. First, they have a desire for food, and then when they get their food that they need, there's the desire for more and more, which can be seen in all sorts of different aspects of life. But that's not really what I want to focus on. We can also see that Israel is acting out against God, and we can see that God is oh so very patient with Israel, but there's moments here where he gets angry with Israel. He's frustrated with what they have, what they've done, what they're doing, and he gets angry. And this is really what I want to focus on here. Is I want to take a look at these moments where God's angry, because it can be oh so easy to see God as angry and wrathful, especially in the Old Testament. But you often forget, or I know I do, is I forget what I can learn from God's anger. Because really, when you look in these moments where God is angry, you can really see what some of his values are, what it is that he finds important. So that's what I'm going to take a look at here, is some of these moments that surround the lines where it says, God's anger burned against Israel or against Aaron, or all of these different moments. We can see why God's anger burned. We can see that Israel was ungrateful when they were given the manna that they needed to survive. They were ungrateful because they wanted to have meat. They were reminded of the fish that they had when they were serving as slaves in Egypt. So they were ungrateful with the provision that God had given them. And we can also see Aaron and Miriam were speaking against God's chosen leader and really God's friend, Moses. The end of the chapter describes how Moses was the only one who knew God face to face on that personal level. They had a very special, close relationship, and no other prophet was spoken to the way that Moses was. Other prophets received dreams or visions commonly, but Moses was able to stand and talk with God face to face. So there's this special relationship. And Aaron and Miriam, the brother and sister of Moses, were gossips, and they were speaking against the appointed leader that God had chosen to lead Israel. Then we also see that God threatened to destroy Israel because of their lack of faith. They were so fearful that they were immobilized. You can see when you read through that God wasn't angry with Israel because they were afraid, but they allowed their fears to overcome their faith. Their fear was greater than their faith, and that is when God became angry with Israel. And it's these moments that really show a lot about who God is. They show us what his values are. We can see that God values a thankful heart, a heart that's filled with gratitude instead of selfish desires. We can see that God values when we respect the appointed leaders in our lives, whether that be a pastor or a political leader, whether it's a boss in a workplace. God values when we respect the leaders who have been placed above us. And God also values faith. He values when we put our trust in him, and he values when we are obedient to him. These are the moments that really reflect what God's values, what his passions are. If you're passionate about something, there'll be moments where things get heated, right? God is passionate about his people and this relationship, and when they turn their backs on him over and over again, of course he's going to be angry. You can see God's love and God's values through what makes him angry. We can also see in a moment where Moses disobeys God. This is another example of God's value for obedience. Moses disobeys God when he brings water from the rock. He was told to speak to the water, to tell it to come forth, yet he strikes the stone twice. Moses is frustrated with Israel just as much as God is, and yet because of his frustration, he becomes disobedient as well. And because of his disobedience, Moses was denied access to the promised land. We can also see how Israel commits idolatry to God. They begin to worship other gods as they've already done before, and they commit sexual immorality. They're committing sin after sin, and God really, he has lots of reasons to be angry with Israel. And yet even after all of these different things, God still chooses to forgive his people. He provides them with means of salvation, and he keeps his promise by delivering Israel into the promised land. I'm reminded of the bronze snake. I'm sure that some of you are more familiar with some of the symbolism behind that. This being that's raised up, that is hung on some form of pole or post, or perhaps even a cross shape of some sort. And when one looks to that being, they are given a means of salvation. God still cares for his people. That's why he's angry with them. It's because he loves them. And he provides them with means of salvation, and he remains faithful despite his anger. And I think it's a perspective like this. I think that's why it's important to be going through the story, especially in small groups and with the study material. It's because it allows us to have these new perspectives and to see God's story from a different level of depth. A different level of depth. It's easy to see how God is angry. God is angry in several places in the Old Testament. And we can see Jesus makes drastic and actions based on anger in the temple or with the Pharisees. There are lots of moments where God is angry, where Jesus shows anger, but there are moments that you can learn so much more than just the surface value. You can see how the priorities of God, the values that Jesus have, you can see that through the anger if you're willing to look at it a little bit deeper, more than just the surface value. And that's really the big thing that I got out of chapter 6 of the story this week. So With that, I'm going to wrap up. I want to say, thank you for listening. I hope that this is something that just gets you thinking about how God is moving and working through the story in Scripture as well as in your own lives personally each and every day. Until next week, I guess I'll leave it there. And hey, at that point, I'll be all done my exams and should be back in the St. John area. So that'll be exciting. Maybe I get to have a little bit of rest so that I can be energized by sleep instead of just coffee. Anyway, until then, God bless.